reasonably easy thing to entertain a group of students, but it's much more difficult to do that with something and make sure that they're learning. We need to embrace it. We need to understand how it's changing and how it can be used. But as far as the learning is concerned, it's just as good as having a teacher in the classroom, and we have evidence to prove that. And it's something that a lot of language teachers don't think about. Before you bring any technology into the classroom, you have to think about, what am I doing this for? For example, I think that's a very powerful tool that will help students improve. It's because there's so much out there that it can feel overwhelming. It can't just be for technology's sake. You do need to, and you have a responsibility to your students, but also to yourself, to be curious.
Tutor and Tech. Project about teaching languages, learning, technology, and how they co-evolve together.
Hello, and welcome everybody. This is Tutor and Tech, project about teaching languages, learning languages, and technology, and how they all co-evolve together. My name is Dima Basenko. I'm your host and also author of the project and co-creator of Ver, application for intermediate level language learners in higher to improve vocabulary. It is WOOR.app. And today here with me is Graham Stanley. I'm super excited to talk to you, Graham, and thanks a lot to agree to meet with me.
A great pleasure. I always like talking about language learning, teaching, and technology, so thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. I truly feel privileged, actually, to talk to you, and really appreciate that you entered and ready to discuss the topic with me. I'm very excited about what our conversation is going to be like. Let me read one thing first. Over 20 years of experience working in education sector. Co-author of Digital Play Computer Games and Language Aims. Won a British Council ELT Innovation Award for Teacher Development. Author of Language Learning with Technology, which won the English-Speaking Union HRH Duke of Edinburgh Award for ELT Book of the Year. Editor of Remote Teaching for British Council. Teacher Development Lead at British Council. Is everything right? And did I miss anything?
Yes, no, that sounds very right. Thank you.
You seem to be very busy with a lot of things. I know that you also pretty often participate or create, I don't know, the podcast about languages. You write books, you speak at conferences, and which got me interested. How do you define yourself and what you are doing? Are you researcher? Are you teacher of teachers or something else? How would you put it?
It's a good question. I was a language teacher, an English language teacher for many years. I was always interested in technology. Prior to being a language teacher, I was doing all sorts of things, including database programming and other stuff.
Wow.
Just a little bit back in the day when it was easier than it is now, I think. And so it was clear when I moved into language teaching that technology was something that I was going to be interested in, particularly as that was what was just starting to emerge. And I've just followed my interests and my curiosity, really. So I started experimenting in the classroom. I played computer games that led to me and a colleague sharing ideas of how we could use computer games in the classroom at the time when it wasn't really very much used. I've always felt myself, even though I'm no longer a classroom teacher, as a teacher, not a researcher. So I'm very happy to be the bridge between people who are doing research and teachers, so teacher education, dissemination of research. I make sure I try to read research. I like the idea of taking things and making them easier for teachers to come across. So I like taking research and turning it into activities or easier to digest and more interesting and practical for the teacher to use than perhaps reading academic research papers, because most teachers don't have the time to do that. So I kind of think of myself more of a bridge between those two worlds. I like the idea of being able to help teachers with things such as educational technology, for example.
Yeah, quite a journey. And yeah, this actually here sounds pretty interesting. To consider yourself as a bridge between researchers and teachers. That's interesting position to be in. What drives you actually to do so many things?
It's just a natural curiosity. I'm teaching for me is vocational learning, teaching. It's something that isn't something that I've done and turn off after a particular time. I'm very interested in it. It's a bit like a journey of understanding more about what makes good teaching, what makes good learning, in particular with language learning and teaching, but not only. How you can best apply technology to learning and teaching is always something that has interested me. What kind of emerging technology is best to use in the classroom and how to use it, etc. Those are the things that drive me. And I like the idea of writing. For example, I've always enjoyed writing, and so writing about technology for teachers so that they can understand it better is always something that interests me as well.
Nice. And yeah, I feel that I'm lucky that you have those passions which span across technology and languages. It's perfect match for me, and I hope that people who watch or listen to this. I'm quoting from your description, I think, in LinkedIn. You wrote, "My specialty is the use of technology for learning and professional development." I define, speaking of technology, I define technologies very broadly. It can be conference tools, it can be online content in social media, it can be applications, it can be electronic books, and so on. So it's a lot of different things. When you talk about technology, how do you define it?
I think I would define it in the same way that you do, but I find myself drawn to technology that requires interpretation, if you like, or requires a bit of imagination in its use. So I understand that for most teachers, what makes a lot of sense is something that is very easy to use, that they can just create an account with and use in the classroom. It makes sense. It has a kind of structure, etc. Me personally, I get excited about technology that requires a bit more imagination, or perhaps requires someone to experiment a little bit, perhaps to use a technology that for something that it wasn't designed for, or not obviously. An example would be the computer games, for example. Computer games for education that I was interested in weren't, for language learning, for example, weren't the computer games that were written by developers for language learning. They were computer games that anyone would use. They were good games that would appeal to gamers anyway. And the fun bit for me and my colleague when we were experimenting with that was to try and figure out if some of these games, or which of these games, would be best suited to helping the practice of language and how you would do it.
Yeah, I heard feedback from people that they learned languages by playing games unintentionally. So they just played and they learned. So even if it's not designed for learning, it still can be learning in the end because people are so engaged in doing this. Since you mentioned gaming, actually, I watched your speech on some conference back from 2013, I think, and you already spoke about games and in learning and gamification. You asked there, how many of you know what is gamification? And I didn't see the crowd, but you told that not so many hands were raised. How many teachers do you think today would raise their hands?
Oh, a lot more. I think gamification is an interesting one because when it first came out, it was very much a buzzword, and I was very excited to understand how it could be used in particular to motivate students, but also looking at gamification not from the kind of level of just points, leaderboards, and badges, but looking at other aspects of games like story and other game mechanics that were very engaging for the people who played them. Because I think a lot of the criticism that back then and still now that gamification gets is that if it's just a superficial if it's just the superficial aspect of games that someone lifts and tries to put onto something to gamify it, then it probably won't last very long or be very rewarding or motivating. So I think there's a lot more to gamification than meets the eye. That said, I think it's a lot more. There are a lot more teachers who engage with gamification now, whether they be through a lot of apps, some of which are really good and very interesting for students to use in the classroom or outside of the classroom to be able to learn. But I still think there's a lot more there to explore.
Yeah, that's true. Speaking of gamification, it is also probably a double-edged sword in the sense that when I did my product research, I heard feedbacks that I would like to use applications for language learning, but there is no option for me to use anything that feels like learning. I'm so tired by the end of the day, and getting into another sort of work is not an option for me. But at the same time, I recently read Duolingo CEO interview, and he also told that one of the hardest trade-offs which they think of is where should they trade off educational aspect for entertaining for entertainment, so that people stay engaged. Because if people got disengaged and go away, that's it. They're lost. And as a product users, obviously, but also as learners as well. So they have to find a balance.
Definitely, it's where it's the holy grail, if you like, because it's this idea of in the same when I was using games or gamification in the classroom, for example, it's a very easy thing or a reasonably easy thing to entertain a group of students, but it's much more difficult to do that with something and make sure that they're learning. So there's that balance between, as you say, making activities fun and making them rewarding and enriching. When it does happen, then it's fabulous to be part of. There are a number of instances as a classroom teacher where I kind of look around and the students are engaged and they're really trying hard to use, in my case, the English language to communicate with each other. Because they were interested so much in the game and the task to do so that they weren't really thinking about something being hard, but what they were trying to do. If it had been done in another situation, they would have complained or been felt demotivated or found it difficult. But because they were so engaged in a game, they didn't really think about how much they were learning or practicing the language.
Yeah, this is amazing. This is a perfect situation when people are just engaged in sort of playing and then not even maybe understanding that they are on the other side already knowing new things. Yeah, this is a perfect probably scenario for everybody. To align a little bit on context, and wanted to ask you about learners as well. If you would define levels of learning a language, how would you define those levels?
Well, I think there are lots of different frameworks, and the one I keep referencing is the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, the CFR. So that's a tool that's been widely adopted, and it's done a great job of trying to compare different levels across different languages. So this idea of, you start off at an A0 level and progress to an A1 level, it's a framework, so it can always be adapted. I know it's definitely adopted by a lot of government ministries of education in the Americas, for example. So that is a good way of trying to measure learners, really.
And besides levels, from your experience as well, do you define any archetypes or profiles of how people learn languages based on motivation, maybe, or style of learning, or something else?
It's not something you can generalize very easily, I think, or it's not something that you should generalize because it's a cliche, but everyone is different. Everybody's circumstance, context is different. What they have access to, their background, what they know, what they want out of life and out of learning a language is different. That said, this idea of motivation is an interesting one with language learners. There's the learners who just want to learn the basics to go on holiday. They're interested in the culture, the language. They just want to be able to feel that they're not totally ignorant when they're speaking to others, that they can order a coffee, etc., on the experience. And they'll have a better experience if they're able to speak a little bit of the language, even if it's very little. If they're abroad when they do that, they'll also have a much better reception if they try speak a language. Then there's people who, in between, there are lots of others, but there are people who are really motivated and want to very much communicate, converse with speakers of another language. There are people who really, their goal is to read books in another language. There's lots of different reasons for it.
Yeah, and the process itself is sometimes pretty engaging and interesting. I wanted to ask you about teaching now. So you are in education for quite a while, and I wanted to ask you to compare technology in teaching, maybe when you started 10 years ago and right now. How are they different? How teaching changed throughout this period?
Well, it's difficult to summarize, but I think
Yeah.
perhaps the increase in technology in teaching and learning languages is probably the biggest difference from when I first started teaching. It's affected the way people learn. It's affected methodology. It's affected what happens in the classroom now. And I think when I first started, the internet was just quite new. And so I always remember going to teach a class of adults, and there was one computer connected to the internet in the staff room. And the owner of the school, it was a language academy, printed out an article back then of an attempt on the life of the then Spanish president, and he made a gap fill activity out of it, and I took it into class, and it had just happened an hour before the class, and that was unheard of. The students were looking at this and it's like, they were reading news and trying to understand it in English, and it was all very new. And that was a really big aha moment for me. It's like, if we can get current affairs and activities and things that are so up to date into the classroom, then that's a way of motivating students. So that was one of my first sort of connections with the internet and teaching back then. Obviously, since then, there was an explosion in Web 2, that the read-write web with blogs, keys, podcasts. That was a really exciting time because the idea of publishing student work, even if it's just for other people in the class to see, or in the school, or their parents of your young learners, that suddenly had a very motivational effect on students when they were writing or speaking for an audience. Whenever anyone has an audience for what they're communicating with, or a real audience rather than just the teacher and they're doing it just to learn, then that is a very engaging thing. And you can get them to practice and refine their writing or their speaking, to rehearse, etc., to be able to become a lot better at it. But then I think around that time, when technology was entering in the classroom, I remember there was a lot of debate about it, a lot of teachers who didn't want technology to become used in classes. And there was a lot of discussion from people like myself who said, well, this is part of life outside the classroom, so why shouldn't it have a place in the classroom? And that was quite interesting. I think those who argued for technology to be in the language learning process and classroom, I think basically won out, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be used all of the time. I think it's very, very important that it's only used in a kind of principled way. So only when it's going to help the learning. If it's going to take the learner further than they would without it, then that's important. If it helps with motivation, or if it's a way of them being able to learn quicker or easier, then that's fine. But you have to be very careful with technology in the same way that we talked about with games, etc. It can't just be for technology's sake. You can't be trying to teach with technology if it's not the best way to do it. You might be interested in the technology, but you don't have to bring it into the classroom if it's not going to serve the learning outcomes, for example.
Yeah, change is hard, and there is always pushback when people are not willing to change old ways, right? And speaking of being careful with technology, do you think that there are changes which are actually harming education?
Yeah, I think from a very general point of view, usually anything that is brought into the classroom or the school or into education without careful thought about the reason for doing so, and as I said before, without careful thought about whether this is actually going to further the learning outcomes, whether it's going to be easier, better, more motivating to learn, is damaging. So I'll give you an example. I once was at a conference presentation where someone presented an idea. There was a big screen and a VR headset, and he presented the idea of going into a classroom with one VR headset. One student wears the headset, the image is displayed on the big screen, and the other students talked about it. And it just didn't seem to be a good use of time or a way of doing it. There wasn't anything in that activity that made me think, yes, the students are learning more than they would if you didn't have the VR headset on and were just talking to each other, or even, just showing moving pictures or talking through a game on the screen. It didn't add anything to have the VR headset. So that was an example of someone who got a VR headset and thought, I can use this, and was determined to kind of bring it into the classroom to use with students, rather than thinking it through and wondering, is this actually going to add any value to the learning or teaching experience? And obviously it didn't. And there are lots of instances with that, I think.
Yeah, technology for the sake of technology doesn't really work too often. And in terms of positive examples, obviously there are a lot of things that changed, a lot of things that appeared right now, especially the last couple of years. But if I would ask you about 2-3 main positive things, what would you say were changes which brought the most good?
It's difficult just to boil it down to 3. I think one of the things, it's not in the last 3 to 5 years, but I mentioned it before, I think the ability to record students and have them listen back to their learning is a really powerful tool. And it's something that a lot of language teachers don't think about. But the idea of someone being able to record, listen back to their own language, and if they're able to learn from that with the help of some kind of analysis, be it a teacher or other, or about the way that they're speaking, for example, I think that's a very powerful tool that will help students improve. If you get the chance to watch yourself, for example, on video presenting or teaching as a teacher educator, for example, that is amazing to see yourself in the classroom it's not usually possible to do so. So the recording video, recording audio, and being able to use, if it's not just to do that, but to be able to use that to learn, for analysis, is really powerful. Video conferencing, I think, has really changed the game. We have a video conferencing project in Uruguay, the British Council that is, that we've been helping the Uruguayan government with, to be able to bring teachers in from Argentina and elsewhere to the country because there was a shortage of teachers. So this idea of being able to bring in expertise through video conferencing. And when we look at the results of those upper primary students, we see no difference between those who have face-to-face teachers and those who have virtual remote teachers when it comes to what they learn. That is a very powerful thing to be able to do, I think, because back then, this was 12 years ago, there was a kind of real doubt in people's mind about whether the experience was just a kind of, well, we can do this. It isn't as good as having a teacher in the classroom, but we can do it. But as far as the learning is concerned, it's just as good as having a teacher in the classroom, and we have evidence to prove that, which I think is interesting. Obviously, you do have that missing human being in the classroom, which when you ask the students what they would do to change it, that's the one thing they would prefer, because they like to have an actual person with them physically in the classroom. So there's that. And then, of course, AI, I think, the Gen AI is the big exciting thing. And that is really more than any other technology that's going to disrupt the way that people teach and learn. It's not only disrupting the way that people teach and learn at the moment, and not only teaching and learning, but it's also disrupting things like what we consider writing is changing. Writing is never going to be the same again. People aren't going to think of writing as perhaps what my generation thought of writing. It's gradually been added to with dictionaries and spell checkers and all sorts of other grammar tools, etc., over the years. But this is overturning what writing is. It's basically, writing is very much giving a short prompt and having AI produce a letter or a report, or even as it's happening now, a book for your film script that then gets turned into an actual film in the future. All of this is going to change the kind of skill set that people need for work and for education. And the sooner we embrace that, the better, I think. It's a case of a lot of people at the moment thinking, oh, I don't want that to happen. And when it comes to universities, for example, an assessment, a lot of people are still giving the same kinds of assessment. They're just asking the students to come into physical classrooms and start writing with pens again, which is divorced from what they're going to be asked to do when they leave university and go to the real world.
What you told actually is very interesting, and definitely technology have this magical attribute of making things which might have seemed to be futuristic now feel so natural. Also, that you mentioned the recording, such a simple thing, right? But kind of surprised to hear about it. But I do agree it can make a huge difference, and I do think that it may probably not used enough.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we all need to be careful about, that when we are exposed to very new technologies, AI being the newest, if you like, that we don't forget the kind of learning or things that we've done with the other technologies, and stop using them just because they seem not to be new.
Yes, there is definitely fear of missing out when a lot of new things are appearing, right? But it doesn't mean that things which are not that shiny and new are not useful. Speaking of that, I wanted to ask if teachers right now need to navigate this, a lot of new tools appearing, and also how they teach students in class, and how they help them to learn outside of class. What 2-3 things related to technology you would advise to to teachers to either do or not to do?
I think it's important. It's so difficult to generalize because a lot depends,
Yeah.
as I said before, on context. I think it's important for you to, as a teacher, to get to know who your learners are. That's the first thing I would do before thinking about, using technology or whatever. Who are your learners? What are they interested in? What do they do? What kind of technology do they use? Do they come to class with mobile phones, or do you have a policy where they're not able to use mobile phones, for example? What kind of things do you have in the classroom available to you? Can you bring things, if you don't have anything, can you bring things in from home? Can one of your students bring things in from home if you think it's worthwhile? So the more you get to know your students and your context and who they are as people, what they want out of life, out of education, out of learning the language, the better. So that's even before you bring the technology in. And then it's a case of, okay, what do we have access to? What would be useful to be able to use? The next thing I think for teachers to think about is that they shouldn't feel overwhelmed, or they shouldn't be forced into doing something that perhaps just because everyone else is doing it, they feel they should do it. So you shouldn't feel forced into using AI if you're not comfortable with it, if you don't like it, if you haven't the experience of using it. That said, I think that natural curiosity needs to be activated as a person in this world. I think you do need to, and you have a responsibility to your students, but also to yourself, to be curious and to investigate a little bit, to find colleagues who are using things like AI if if it's not familiar to you, and get them to show you how to use it, to look for courses. There's certainly loads of courses online that are even free, to start using different apps, to have a play with them, to share what you use with other colleagues, because there's so much out there that it can feel overwhelming. But start small, follow your nose, try to listen to your students and see what kind of things that they use. Maybe you have a group of students who already are using a number of different apps, for example, to supplement the learning of the language that you're helping them with. Perhaps the other students would benefit from them sharing that. And if there's, 2 or 3 different apps being used by different students, you certainly then can have a conversation about which ones they prefer and why. And perhaps it could be a little project about going away and trying to find the one that suits that class or those students more than the other. Those kinds of things, really. I think it's best not to have a fixed idea about what to do. And then the third thing I think would be to always keep in mind this principles approach. So before you bring any technology into the classroom, you have to think about, what am I doing this for? Why am I doing it? Is this the best way of practicing or learning this language? Is it going to save time, or is it going to actually make me waste a lot of time setting it up or preparing something that is only going to be used for 20 minutes? Am I going to spend 2 hours planning on preparing this, and then we're not going to use much time in the classroom and for other classes? So, and if the answer is, well, actually, I don't think it's worth it, then don't use it. Don't use the technology. So that's, but if you think it through before you bring it into the classroom or start using it with students, then it will be much better.
Yeah, that's fair. So it is foundational to know who you are teaching and why you are bringing certain technology into the learning process, right? And also see what comes naturally for you as a teacher, and maybe from students as audience who already adopted something and they feel that it works.
Definitely.
There is abundance of different tools and applications right now. Can you advise to people on the other side, to students, what kind of applications or digital products can be useful in the learning process, and which might be harmful, or which they should be more careful about?
Yeah, it is also difficult with this to generalize, but I think generally language learners are good at at finding their own way. But if you do want to suggest them, then I think learning from their colleagues is a good thing. What the other more perhaps there are some of the students that are more curious than others, and they've started experimenting things. Or so listening to their experience can give the others a lot more ideas of what to do, rather than you as the teacher, for example, just telling students, you should use this, you should use that. And I think the important thing is this idea of whatever they have access to. So if they have access to television in original language with subtitles, and that's what they like in their free time. So rather than listening to dubbed television programs or films, listen to the films in the original language and try to read and understand at the same time and make the connections. So much of the brain will naturally, you don't have to even try, the brain will naturally try to work it out. Same thing with songs. If you like listening to music, then songs in the language that you're learning is always a good thing. And the same thing, you could look at the lyrics if you're interested in trying to understand it, but otherwise try and sing along with the songs and your pronunciation will get better naturally if you do that, even if you can't sing like me. Things like that, really. Computer games you talked about before, if the learners, if that's their thing, then try to do something with a computer game in the language that you're learning, either, with a group of people who speak that language. You could get together if you have online gaming, or change the language of the actual game. I did that once with a PlayStation game, and I decided I was gonna try and play this massive PlayStation game in French. And I didn't speak or understand much French then, but it was a lot of fun, and it gave that other level of the game to try and understand what was going on. And I was being asked to go on quests, etc., and I wasn't really understanding what I was supposed to do, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I've been there. That helps real well, actually. To wrap it up, I'm going to ask two very short questions regarding the AI. It feels like we are still figuring out how to apply it. Although I hear that a lot of people already find value in it. But speaking of AI, are you excited about it, or you are not intimidated but cautious about usage and what it brings to learning process?
It depends on the day. Everything seems to be changing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
So, some days I'm very excited about it. I see it as a way of saving time, of being able to know more, of being able to have an assistant that can help you with all sorts of things. And I think teachers in general, for example, have moved away from it. Their biggest fear was like, oh, the students are using this to cheat, to being aware of, actually, I can use this to plan, and I can use this to mark, and I can use this to save me time. So a lot of busy teachers are starting to embrace AI just as much or more than the students. What I fear about, and I know it is happening in some circumstances, I hope it's not happening in too many, but, a teacher will plan an assessment, an assignment. They will write a rubric using AI. They will get everything ready for the students. They'll give it to the students without really thinking about it. It's just saved them a lot of time.
Yeah.
They've dashed it off in a minute. The students will use AI to answer it without really looking at the question. They'll just put it into ChatGPT and get an answer. They'll hand it into the teachers. The teacher will hand their answers into the large language model as well and get the marks and give it back to the students. So you then have a whole process where no human being has been involved in the learning or teaching process. And I think that's the big danger. So I think as teachers, our big responsibility now has to be not to ignore this, because the students aren't going to ignore it. And from what I can understand from people I know, as soon as you get to the world of work, this is something that you'll end up you're using So we need to embrace it. We need to understand how it's changing and how it can be used. I think the biggest role a teacher has when it comes to using this is understand that students are going to use it. How can you, but how you understanding that, how can you build in your assessment to be able to assess learning, and rather than just to go through the motions and assess what an output of an LLM is? You want the students to still learn. You want them to be critical. So this idea of critical literacy has become one of the most important things in the curriculum now, I think. So those are some of my fears or hopes, but I do think there are all sorts of ethical problems. There are bias problems when it comes to AI that need to be addressed. And I think and hope that those will be addressed. There's the cost on the climate that using these machines have. I'm hoping that all of this has been raised and has been looked at and will be dealt with in the future. And maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I do think it isn't something you can't ignore, but you do have to think very responsibly as a teacher or as a person about how you use AI and what you use it for, and not just to be frivolous and rattle off hundreds and hundreds of images, for example, that you're never going to use. So you do have to think carefully and responsibly about using it. And ultimately, so long as artificial general intelligence doesn't appear, we'll be okay. I don't think it will replace humans, but if AGI does appear, then I think language teachers will have the last thing, they have to worry, but so will everybody worry, because the machines won't need us.
Yeah, it's a lot of hopes and a lot of fears about it. But I think if there is anything what went through most of the answers you gave me is to be mindful of what we are doing, why we are doing, how it's going to help, and that it actually helps to achieve goals and values. And this is probably not something what AI can very easily substitute us for, right? To wrap it up, I have traditionally very last question. Do you think that AI is going to replace teachers?
Not if we don't reach artificial general intelligence. If we do, then yeah, it will replace not only teachers, but human beings. It'll be the next stage in evolution, whether we like it or not.
Thanks a lot. It was a real pleasure talking to you. In the end, I also give a minute if you want to share with our listeners or watchers to let them know about any projects or plans which you have, or how they can reach you out or find things which you do.
No, I don't have anything particular at the moment. Just thank you very much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed talking about this. It's not often that you get the chance to do this, so thanks for inviting me.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Tutor and Tech. Project about teaching languages, learning, technology, and how they co-evolve together.